Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'm going to show you how to call JavaScript from C#, how to call C# from JavaScript, and even how to pass arrays of complex objects from JavaScript to C#. Perhaps more importantly, though, I'm going to show those of you who are more familiar with Windows Forms and XAML how you can use JavaScript and CSS to do the equivalent of docking and anchoring using absolute positioning. And that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. All right, I'm very excited because I'm going to show you three things that are distinctly unique about JavaScript Interop. The first one is simply calling a JavaScript function from C#. The second one is going to be getting an event from JavaScript, or basically having JavaScript call C# when things happen in the DOM. And thirdly, I'm going to show how to pass back objects from the DOM, arrays of objects from the DOM, and actually have you understand them and work with them. All right, so let's get started. I've got a WebAssembly application here. This is a Blazor WebAssembly app. There's no ASP.NET hosting here. It's just pure WebAssembly. And I'm going to get rid of everything in index and replace it with a little bit of my own code. So here's all we have. We have a button that says show input. When we click the button, we're going to toggle this Boolean show input, set it to true, and then up in the UI, if show input is true, I'm going to show this element. I've got a little margin on it, and most importantly, I've set the ID, because anytime we're interacting with JavaScript, JavaScript needs to know the ID of a div if it's going to work with it. And that's fine. You can set IDs in elements in Blazor just like you can without Blazor. So just to show the default behavior without any kind of JavaScript interop, I'm going to run this and press the button. And it shows up, but what I really want is for this to get focus. In other words, I want my cursor in there like that. So it turns out that setting focus isn't part of the Blazor component model. That hasn't bubbled up into the component model yet. I don't know whether it's going to in the future, but my friends Dan and Steve tell me that yes, they are planning on continuing to evolve the component model and allow these things to come to the surface. But for now, you have to use JavaScript. So where is JavaScript anyway? Well, in a WebAssembly project, it's in www.root. And we're going to expand that, and you'll see index.html right there. So you can see there's already some script here, but we're going to add another script tag. And I'm just going to add what you think might work, which is we have this method called SetFocus, and this is how you set up methods that you can call from C#. Window dot whatever the method is equals, in parentheses, the parameters, and then a lambda to this function. We're looking for an element of ID, whatever's passed in, and then we're going to call focus and maybe select too. So select, if there's something in the input, it's going to select everything. The whole idea is that as soon as that thing shows up, I just want to start typing. And if there's something in there, I want to start typing over it. So before we can run this, we have to actually call SetFocus. We're going to await JS, which is my IJS runtime that I've injected, invoke void async, SetFocus, and the argument is my input text, which is the ID of my input element. Let's see what happens. Wow, we got an error. What is it? Let's take a look. Okay, cannot read property focus of null. So when we went to get that element by ID, it came back null. Why is that? Well, think about it. We've got a button clicked, and we've set this show input to true, and then called this JavaScript. But at the time we're calling the JavaScript, this guy doesn't exist, right? Because the page hasn't rendered yet. Now, I could hook the onAfterRendered event, figure out the precise time or the precise state that the page needs to be in for me to call focus, but that's a lot of work. I think there's a better way to do it. So here's my solution. SetFocus is going to call internal focus, but only after 10 milliseconds have passed. Okay? SetTimeout is a great little function in JavaScript that says, I want you to call this after this many milliseconds and past that. And if you have other arguments, you can just add them here. So internal focus is going to call getElementById and check to see if it's null. And if it is, it's going to call itself again in 10 milliseconds. All right? But if not, if the element is not null, then we'll set focus and we'll do select. So this is just a little stupid JavaScript trick that I learned to get around that situation where I want to call some JavaScript and operate on a div whether or not it is yet visible or in the DOM. So let's see how that works out. And now you can see my blinking carrot. So that's the easy stuff. Let's call JavaScript. Great. How do we get JavaScript to call us back? Well, if we're going to do that, we have to pass a reference to the page that we're using, our index page, and then JavaScript has to use that reference to call a method on that page. So this is an example of what I want to do to illustrate this. It's a real-world example. In fact, if you plan on moving any kind of code or trying to move any kind of code from a desktop application like a Windows Forms app or a WPF app to a Blazor app, this might be really interesting to you. Now, the way HTML and CSS work typically is that divs and spans, things that contain other elements, are usually adaptive in terms of their positioning, you know, the top and left, and the width and the height. Generally speaking, height is created automatically as elements expand into it, but there are ways that you can pin a div to a top left width height rectangle and say, I want you to stay there. It's called absolute positioning. And so in order for us to take advantage of absolute positioning and get that sort of docking and feeling that we got from Windows Forms and WPF, that sort of functionality for docking and anchoring, we have to hook an event in the browser, in the DOM, and it's called onResize. So when the body resizes, I want to know what the width and height of that window in the browser is, so I can use that to calculate where my div should be and position it absolutely. So this is a really good example of that, and you can see I've got a div here that has a bunch of elements, and I've just got squares in here, but it scrolls just to show you that that it is its own div and it is completely resized to the browser. Also, I've set the background color so that you can differentiate it from everything else. And I've got a little footer at the bottom, right? And it stays at the bottom. So you can think of this in the desktop world as being anchored or docked to the bottom, and then this div here is docked to fill. And at the top, this element here is docked to the top or anchored to the top. Also, I want it to be adaptive so that any time that the UI changes and things move around, I want to be able to adjust for that. And Blazor has this great feature, the template, the default template, that when you resize it low, right, the top bar goes away and the nav bar becomes this drop-down menu. And when I drop down the menu, I want everything to resize as well. Okay, back in our project, I'm going to replace all of this with some markup. And I've got two divs. One is called My Big Div, that's at the top. And this is the one that has the background color set to antique white. And I've got 10 boxes, 300 by 300. The background color is light coral, and I've got the element name, just something to fill the space. Now I've also got overflow set to auto on this div. And what that will do is, no matter how high the div is, if things go down below, the height, we're going to add a scroll bar. Then at the bottom, I have this footer div, and I just have the height and the padding and a background color. Nothing major there. So without any kind of resizing or positioning, this is what it looks like. Okay, so it's obviously not what we want. You can see that there's a margin around the main div here, and the whole page scrolls, and then the footer is at the bottom. That's okay, but that's only because it's relative to this particular div. What I really want is that footer to stick to the bottom, and I want this div to fill up the space, but no more than that. All right, so let's go back to JavaScript, and I will show you the resize code. There's a bunch of stuff here, so bear with me. First of all, we have this .NET helper that I've created, and I want to register my page passing in this .NET object so that JavaScript has access to it. And I've set my .NET helper to that, because that's how we're going to invoke methods in C# with .NET helper. But before we can do that, we need to call this body resized function every time the body resizes, and that's just an on resize on the body. So right here we're telling the browser, hey, anytime the body, or everything in the HTML DOM, anytime that window resizes, I want you to call body resized. So body resized is going to invoke our window resized method, which we haven't written yet, but this is going to be a C# method, passing in the inner width and inner height of the window. I also have this force resize, which can call body resized, which will allow us to hook that on demand. All right. Now what we're going to call inside the window resized method in C# is resize element absolute. So we pass in the ID, the top, left, width, and height. And if the element is not null, we're going to set the position of all these style things, position absolute, top, left, width, and height to these values, but we're going to tack on px because these are strings essentially, and we want to make sure that we're doing it by pixel because that is the unit that we're working with. All right, so back in index, I'm going to add some code here. Let's take a look at all of this stuff. Here's my window resized method. I've got this JS invocable attribute on it, and that means we can call it from JavaScript. Very cool. Let me make some more room here. Down and on initialized async, I'm going to create a .NET object reference from my page, and pass that to register my page, .NET helper. And then I'm going to call force resize, which is going to force JavaScript to call my window resized method just the first time with the window width and window height. Now I can get dimensions of the divs that are in my page, and I can use those to create top left width and height values right here. And then I can call my resize element absolute, passing in those top left width and height values. And I'm also doing the same thing for the footer, because the footer is now at the bottom of the page. So I just have to place that using a little bit more math on those values. Okay, now where do I get these values? Well, check it out. I've got this get element height and get element width, which are just returning the client height and client width of the element that I pass in. But top div, sidebar div, I don't know what those are. Well, that's because those aren't defined yet. Let's go to the main layout and take a look. Look at this. This is just the stuff that comes with Blazor. I didn't do this. This just comes with a template. So the nav menu on the left is in a div, the class of which is sidebar, but we're going to add an ID to it. And the top row also has a class but no ID. So I want an ID here and I want an ID here. And just like that, poof, ID equals sidebar div and ID equals top div. All right, let's give it a shot and see what happens. Yay, it works. And as I resize, everything resizes with me. And this is very much more like a desktop application in how we deal with the docking and anchoring, right? Now, what happens when we move over to this? Well, I've actually got some code in here to check to see if the top div width and div height is 0. And that's going to be the case when we sort of shrink down. And in that case, for the top, I want to use the sidebar height, because the sidebar, the nav bar, goes up to the very top, right? And for the width, I just want the window width, right? So just a little stuff going on in there. But there is one problem here, and it's this. I don't know if you can hear, but I'm clicking. Nothing's happening. Well, yeah, actually it is expanding, but since we have placed our div completely over everything else, our big div is hiding this. So what we really need to do is force a resize whenever this item is clicked. Let's take a look at the nav menu. So the nav menu actually has this toggle nav menu that gets called whenever we want to expand or collapse the menu. All I really need to do is call that JavaScript force resize right here. And I'll do that. So I've injected the runtime, the JavaScript runtime, and I've added this one line of code, force resize. Okay, here's the test. Boom. Yay, it works. Awesome. Now, let's talk about real world, okay? If you're doing a typical web application from scratch with Blazor, you're probably not going to use this technique. But if you're, as I said before, you got one of those projects that started in Windows and, you know, the UI model is completely baffling for you and you want to move over code that expects things to be docked and anchored, this is the way to go. Now, for the last demo, I want to show you something a little bit more advanced, and that is We have the ability to call JavaScript from C#. We have the ability for JavaScript to call C#. Now I want to be able to pass back complex types from JavaScript, because let's face it, there's a lot of APIs that return arrays of objects. And so how do you deal with that? Well, to illustrate this, I'm going to create on this page two drop-down lists. One is going to have all of the available microphones on your system, and the other is going to have all the available video input devices or webcams. And you can enumerate those in JavaScript, and once we have the list, we're going to pass it back to C# as an array of objects, and then we need to deserialize them and then put them in list boxes and see what happens. So to get started with this, we need a class, browser media device. This is actually the shape of the class of these objects that get passed back from JavaScript. For each device, it's going to have a device ID. They're all strings, a kind, like audio input, video input, a label, which is what you're going to display in the dropdown, and a group ID, which we're not using, but it's part of the object, so I put that in there. Okay, let's look at the JavaScript for this. And this is some hairy stuff right here, because if you've never seen asynchronous JavaScript with promises, this might be a really good learning opportunity for you. So again, we've got the .NET object that we're passing in. If it's the .NET helper is null, we're going to set it because we're going to need that because we're calling back. So this is all the stuff to deal with the audio context and media devices, and to see if your browser supports it. And if everything works, we're going to call get user media on Navigator media devices. And we want the constraints to say both, I want devices that are both audio and video. And then we have .then, which is to take after this asynchronously executes, then we want to execute this function, passing in the stream, which is the return value from get user media, enumerate devices with the same constraints, and then we have our devices. And also, I've got this device status changed method that just takes a string. We're going to implement that in C# too, just in case we want to show some feedback to the user if there's a problem. And then essentially we're just passing back this devices to our C# available devices method. Now, let me show you the code for this. This is so cool. All right. So we've got two lists of browser media device, audio input devices, and video input devices. I've got a string device status that we can set if there's an issue and show. Here's my available devices, and it's passing an array of objects. See that? So we're not actually specifying the actual type here. We're just getting an array of objects. I'm using the JSON serializer, so I'm going to need a using statement for system text JSON. And also we need to call enumerate devices down here in onInitialized. That's it. Enumerate devices with the .NET helper. All right. So here's our device status changed. We're just setting device status equals status message. And in available devices, we go through each one. We change each object to a string. We deserialize that because it's JSON. And that gives us our browser media device object. So now I'm checking the kind property. And if it's an audio input, we're going to add it to our new list of browser media devices. And also I'm checking the label. Sometimes we'll get back from JavaScript objects that have the label not set. So I only want devices where the label is set and the device ID is set. And I'm going to add those to my list. Same for video input devices. Now, how do I display all that? Well, it's just displaying stuff that's in a list, and we've done that before using selects. So here it is. We've got a div. I got our device status at the top if there is an issue. If audio input devices is not null, then we're going to list those out in a select, right? I don't have the rest of the code for dealing with audio, but I just want to show you that we can get an array of complex objects back from JavaScript and show them in the UI. Let's run it and see what happens. Now this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a message that this website wants to use your microphone and your camera, and you have to give it permission. And then it's going to go ahead and do the rest of the code. Here's your list of microphones. Here's your list of video cameras. And Bob's your uncle. Back to you in the studio, Carl. So now you have all the skills you need to incorporate JavaScript into your Blazor apps. And hopefully you Windows Forms and XAML gurus out there won't be so intimidated by CSS going forward. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.